Okay, folks, let's all take a seat and get our forum going. This is part of a series. This forum is sponsored by 5 organizations: the Sustainable Bainbridge, Climate Action Bainbridge, the Citizens Climate Lobby, Island Power, and EcoAdapt. And of course, we are grateful to the Eagle Harbor Church for supplying us this lovely meeting space, which they do for so many organizations. So this part of the series kicked off in January with 4 reports that really immersed us in the bad news. So there was a report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a climate change assessment from the US government, and 2 more. And that really helped us understand where we stand in terms of the seriousness of our dilemma. And of course, everybody here has heard the dire warnings from the IPCC that if we don't turn this around really fast in the next 12 years, our future does not look good at all. That is the effort to keep our temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which will be a huge challenge. So, in March, we moved on to action, and there was a session at the Good Egg looking at both what the state legislature is doing, and we'll get to that in a moment, and also what we're doing right here on Bainbridge Island. In May, there will be another of these sessions. This one will be on adaptation, and Laura Hansen is in charge of that. And for all of you who have heard Laura speak, you will know you're in for a treat. She's incredibly clear and informative, and always sprinkles her talks with lots of humor. So that's May. It's May 22nd at the Good Egg at 7 o'clock. And then in June, we hope to have a session of the Climate Energy Forum on the suit that 21 children are bringing against the US government for supporting the fossil fuel industry, even though they know it is ruining their constitutional right to a decent future. So that's the plan for the future. And today, we are focusing on energy. And there's 3 big topics. One is our current sources of energy. Another is possibilities for local generation of clean energy. And the third is on buildings and the opportunities for conservation. So that's what today will look like. And I want to just kind of put our efforts for Bainbridge Island, kind of small place, but they're all in the context of something much huger that's going on. And I will tell you, I am personally excited about what I see as a global awakening. I mean, I know you're familiar with what this little Swedish 16-year-old is doing, Greta Thunberg, getting kids all over the world to walk out of school and tell their governments, you got to do something and you got to do it now. And of course, we have the IPCC warnings, which I think are really grabbed people's attention. The media seem to be covering climate change like I've never seen them do it before. And in the country, we of course have lots of talk about the Green New Deal. In our state, it is so exciting. I don't know if you're following what our Washington State Legislature is doing, but they are on fire. And they are about to pass a whole raft of bills related to climate change. I want to mention 3 that are particularly relevant to our discussions today. One is the 100% clean energy bill. And David Roberts, who writes for Vox, really an expert. He lives here in Seattle and worked for Sightline for years. And he says this is the best bill in the country, by far, because it helps restructure the utilities industry. And the goal is by 2045, our electricity in this state will be 100% fossil fuel free. And there's milestones all along the way. 2025, coal free, no more coal. Yes, and other milestones to get to that goal of fossil free in 2045. So that one's relevant to our discussion of energy sources. Another bill that coincidentally is relevant to one of our discussions today is on buildings. And the bill there is on energy efficiency in buildings. And what they've done is they've set some standards for the whole state on energy efficiency in building. And they have said if a local jurisdiction, like Bainbridge, wants to have higher standards, they may. So that's cool, because we can talk about what we really want here. And the third bill and all of these have passed both houses, and looks like they're going to do the reconciliation and get the governor's signature really soon. The third one is raising the cap on the amount of solar energy that our utilities have to take back. So this is a pretty smart audience. I'm sure you all know that there's a cap, and they only have to take back so much, and it limits the amount of local generation that you can do. So the legislature has raised that cap, and that is relevant to the discussion that we will have about local generation. So our Washington State Legislature is on our side, and it's opening opportunities for us to take action. So the other exciting thing is what's happening right here on Bainbridge Island. So in late fall of 2017, the City Council approved the formation of the Climate Change Advisory Committee. Was anybody in this room active in advocating for that committee? Yes. Okay, well, you did it. We have it. And we now have a spectacularly expert committee, the Climate Change Advisory Committee. Who in the room is on that committee? Okay, Gary and Mike Cox is the chair. So anyway, we are delighted to have this set of dedicated people advising our city council on what we can do right here. So they have set a goal. They have 3 areas of action. One is reducing our greenhouse gases. Another is adapting to the climate change that we know will happen. And the third is community engagement, and this would be part of that. So on the greenhouse gases front, the goal is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 90% of what they are in or were in 2013. So they took 2013 because it's a year where we have good data. So that's one of the goals, and then there's milestones all along the way, and the first milestone is 2023, which is just 4 years from now, to have reduced those emissions by 25%. That will be a very major challenge to meet. So today, our job is to look at what some of our possibilities are to begin to meet this. Oh, and by the way, the committee will have an inventory of what the sources of our greenhouse gases are that will be out in either June or July, I think. So watch for that. And today, we have 3 presentations to kind of get our minds going on what the possibilities are for us. One will be on energy sources, and Randal Samstag, a professional engineer, expert in energy and water, will present about what our current energy sources are. Another will be on buildings. Jason Wilkinson will talk about that. Jason is an architect with McClellan Design. I'm sure many of you know, is famous for the Living Building Challenge. And he will talk about opportunities for energy efficiency in buildings. And the third presentation will be from Joe Deets, our city council member, and a real innovator on local solar. Some of you know we have solar panels on our city hall, and that is due to the efforts of Joe and his wife, Tammy. So he will talk about possibilities for local generation. So the plan for the day is this. We'll have the presentations, and then at 11 o'clock, we're going to break into groups. So as you listen to their presentation, think about which of the groups you want to join. So we're going to have Jason will be in the back, Joe will be in the front, and Randal will be down the hall in a classroom down there. And they'll each be assisted with a facilitator. Bobby Morgan is going to help Randal, and Herb Heathcote's going to help Jason, and Brian Anderson is going to help Joe. So we're going to do a fast reconfiguration of this room at 11 o'clock so that you can bring all of your ideas into the discussion. And then when we come back at 11:45, we want to hear your two best ideas. So with that, let me start with Randal Samstag talking about our energy sources now. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. Brian's going to flip the slides for me. As she explained, my job is to set the stage for where our energy comes from now and what its climate impacts are, and to evaluate a couple of options that occurred to me as to what our future choices are for energy on Bainbridge Island. So Mike, the chairman of our Climate Change Advisory Committee, gave me this slide to emphasize the fact that, as Fran also emphasized, we're in deep doo-doo. That we know that since the middle of the 19th century, the concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere has gone from around varying between 200 and 250 milligrams per liter to 400 milligrams per liter now. It hadn't been above 250 milligrams per liter in 800,000 years based on ice core data. In the last 50 years, we've gone from around 250 or 300 milligrams per liter to 400. The last time Earth was at 400 milligrams per liter carbon dioxide, sea levels were 100 foot higher. So we basically baked in bad consequences already. And the question is, how will we manage those consequences, and what can we do to stop worse things from happening? This slide shows that we're now emitting 52 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. That includes methane and other greenhouse gases. The World Resources Institute estimates the whole globe will rise to 58 or almost 60 gigatons by 2030. In order to get to, by mid-century, a path consistent with 1.5 degrees centigrade rise, we need to drop, you can see dramatically, from 60 gigatons to 0 by mid-century. Thanks, Brian. So where are we here on Bainbridge? I said my goal is to kind of set up the discussion for our energy future. Where's our energy come from? What are its climate impacts? Those of you, I don't think there are very many people here that don't know that our energy comes from Puget Sound Energy, investor-owned utility. That's the largest utility in the state. We have 12,500 customers. If you divide we produce about 26 megawatts we use about 26 megawatts of power. You divide the one number by the other, you get about 1,500 kWh per month per customer. We have some solar panels, PV panels, and Joe will talk about community solar on the island, and many of the people in the audience may have rooftop solar. We we don't have piped methane, thank heavens, as they do in Bremerton and Silverdale. Which means that most of our houses are heated with electricity, either with radiant heat or heat pumps, or wood, of course, or propane. So what are the climate impacts of this energy mix? This slide shows an estimate of the climate impacts, the carbon pollution from various sectors of the economy for Kitsap County as a whole. It was done by Cascadia Consultants, who are the same organization that's doing the local study. This is a study that was done for 4 counties. I've broken out the data for Kitsap County. What it shows was, to me, somewhat surprising. It showed that 40% of our total carbon pollution comes from our electricity in Kitsap County, from PSE. Greater than the entire transportation sector, which is only 30%. In the overall state, transportation is a bigger piece of the pie than electricity. But here, I think partly that's because the rest of the state, there's a lot of communities that get power from BPA, which is 98% fossil fuel free. There are other factors in this slide. About 11% are from methane, from the natural gas, as the industry calls it. There's a 10% slice for industrial. So I think that the industrial is mostly from the Navy Yard, and I think that we don't have that here. So I'm guessing that when Cascadia comes back, our total amount of carbon pollution coming from our PSE electricity source is going to be about half of our carbon pollution. Thanks, Brian. So who's Puget Sound Energy? 1.2 million customers, the largest utility in the state. In 2009, it sold to the Macquarie Group and sold. It was an investor-owned utility, sold out to a private hedge fund. Macquarie sold out its portion after 10 years. Hedge funds usually get out after 10 years. They sold to some Canadian and Dutch investment funds. The UTC gives them 10% return on investment based on the capital investment. It's the largest carbon polluter of all the Washington utilities by I think, massive amount. The CEO of PSE is currently the CEO of the American Gas Association, which is a lobbying organization for what the industry calls the natural gas industry. I call the methane industry. And its rates and bills are about 25% greater than the state average. Of course, there are a lot of older utilities in the public power sector that have been public power for a long time and have relatively low rates. Next slide, please. So this is a fuel mix comparison it comes from the Department of Commerce. Every year or two, they publish a fuel mix standard for all the 65 utilities in the state of Washington. Here's PSE's fuel mix. 37% is from coal, 22% is from methane, so 59% fossil fuel based. This is a fuel mix for Jefferson County PUD, which was the last public power utility formed in the state. It's 87% hydropower, 98% fossil fuel free. Brian. I said PSC's carbon pollution was massive. This is not the slide that shows how much more in gross they are. This is how much pollution they produce per customer. So for every customer of PSE, which includes me and most of the people in the room, I presume, we're producing 9 tons of carbon pollution per year. That compares to customers that are served by public power utilities from getting power from BPA. They produce about 0.6 tons per year of CO2. Not because BPA produces any carbon pollution in their generation. They don't, but they buy some electricity on the open market that results in their fuel mix having about 2 to 2.5% carbon. Again, my job is to set up the discussion, a community discussion on what our choices are and what we should be doing as citizens, as advocates to the City Council, in order to guide our energy supply in the future. I've laid out a couple of options. When we go back to the back room, I'm anticipating that we'll come up with some more. I've listed them here, and I'll go through them. I'm not going to cover the last three, microgrids, conservation, and local solar, because that's going to be a discussion from the following speakers. So the first choice is PSE's current 50 by 40 plan. This picture here is David Mills, who's a vice president of Puget Sound Energy, and showed up on my Facebook page. PSE has a Facebook page for Bainbridge. You've probably all seen it. And he was explaining what their plan is. Their plan is to cut carbon pollution by 50% by 2040. Now, you may recall that what we heard from Fran was that for us, we wanted 100% by 2040. So the plans are not matched. Where that plan comes from is explained in more detail in their integrated resource plan for 2017. The black line here represents what they call the baseline. That's the amount of pollution that their generation will make if there's no carbon tax and no other. There were 5 or 6, looked like about 8 or 10 actually, different scenarios. But the base scenario is that black line that assume no carbon tax, and we've had an opportunity to pass 2 carbon taxes, and they both failed. So that's we anticipate it's going to be where we're heading. Basically, what it shows is they're planning when Colstrip 1 and 2 come offline in 2025, they'll drop from about 12 million tons to 10 million tons, and then gradually build over time to 2035 to be back basically where they are now at around 12 million tons. And then precipitously they will drop to their from between 2035 and 2040. That's where the 50 by 40 comes in the last 5 years after Colstrip 3 and 4 come offline, because they're 50-year-old equipment. 2 other programs that PSE has, Green Power, which our family gets and a lot of you do. It's a renewable energy certificate or credit. It's an extra cent per kilowatt hour. It's a 10% premium over the regular rate. You buy the credit, but you don't buy the electrons. Their other choice program for residential energy it's a new program for Solar Choice. I went on the website, and for 1,500 kilowatt hours a month, I figured out that premium for Solar Choice would be 38% over the regular rate. Next slide, please. PSE's Green Direct program is another one that we've heard quite a bit about on the island. They've offered this to the city. The offer that the PSE gave to the city was just basically to keep the lights on at City Hall, not for the rest of us in residences around the island. The city would sign a contract. It would replace, the city already gets RECs for 100% of the lights at City Hall. That represents about 1% of the total load on the island. It was rejected by the city for various reasons. That last one is one that's significant. That's sufficient for me. Next slide. I'm known as the Grinch in our group for referring to the state energy plan as the do nothing plan. For us, if we do nothing, the state will take care of this by 2045, assuming the loopholes are not used. We'll have 100% clean energy by 2045. It replaces the Energy Independence Act, which had goals of 15% by 2020. Now it's extended to 2045, 100% clean energy by then. There are, I'm told by former executive directors of the Public Power Association, there are poison pills for public power to make it harder to develop public power utilities in the future. Next slide, please. So that's my last slide. Public power is 62 public power utilities in the state. You may have noticed we had a campaign over the last 2 years to try and convince the city council that that made sense. They didn't act on it. Public power includes public utility districts, municipalities, co-ops. The average rates of these public power utilities is about 25% less than PSE. It's about the reliability of 15 times less carbon pollution than PSE, as we've heard, and it has significantly better reliability. And we could have, that's an option for us still, I maintain, we could have 98% fossil fuel free power, not in 2045, but in 5 years if we started or became part of a public power utility. So, next slide. So, that's over to you, and in this case, over to Fran.
Thank you, Randal. You can see why we call on Randal when we want really good data on what's happening now. So now I want to turn this over to Jason Wilkinson, our architect with McClellan Design, to talk with us about buildings.
Thank you, Fran, and thanks to everyone who's shown up on this beautiful day. It's really nice outside, so it's great to see everyone here. And thanks also to the organizers for putting this event on. My name's Jason Wilkinson. I'm an architect with McClellan Design. I'm also a design review board member, volunteer for the city. And so I have had some first-hand experience of some really great projects here on Bainbridge in terms of sustainable design and building design, but then also some pretty abysmal development that's happened on the island. And so I want to talk about what we can do as an island to improve that. But firstly, I just wanted to pay tribute to Patty Southard, who passed away this week. She was a dear friend of many of us in the green building movement. She headed up the King County Green Tools program, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. And she was a tireless advocate for both green building as well as social justice. So she will be missed. I brought a couple books. This one's on my nightstand. How many people have heard of The Uninhabitable Earth? Yeah, so I don't recommend it if you're looking for some nice, light sort of bedtime reading, but very, very informative. And then Drawdown by Paul Hawken. So this is a great book. It's a toolkit with scientific approaches to draw down greenhouse gas emissions and strategies that are ranked based on their impact. And I think you combine those two books and we've got something that'll scare us into action, and then the other which gives us the roadmap to move forward. So next slide. And so Fran mentioned the IPCC report, and these graphs can be very daunting, right? The fact that we have to get to 50% reduction by 2030, which is less than 12 years away, and zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That can feel kind of overwhelming at many times, but really it's an opportunity. And if you think about this, we have to reimagine all of our systems, and buildings are part of that. So as an architect, I'm excited about this opportunity. But in the spirit of the Green New Deal, we have to realize that we need to come together as a community for businesses, governmental organizations, and everyone. And we can't leave anyone behind, because that's an important aspect of sustainability. We can't just let go of the sight of equity and social justice. Next slide. So why do buildings matter? So globally, buildings account for about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. Here in Washington, that's closer to 27% based on our energy mix. The embodied carbon is a real sticking point, and I'll talk a bit about that later on, but that represents about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. Urbanization is happening rapidly. About half of the world's population lives in cities, and by 2060, that's anticipated to be about 2/3 of the world's population. And we see that here all around us. But every month, New York City is being built globally. Next slide. And the changing climate, the changing weather patterns that we're seeing mean that we have a changing relationship with the built environment. And our buildings are going to need to respond. They're going to need to be operating fossil fuel free, and they're going to need to be able to adapt to this uncertain future that we're entering into. Next slide. So if sustainable design is a spectrum, the notion of green design and high performance building, it still falls in the negative impacts area, right? So those are about reducing harm. And what if we started to look at setting the ideal as the measure of our success? And what would that look like? Next slide. So the Living Building Challenge asks a really fundamental question for buildings, and that is, what does good look like, right? So the model, the metaphor is a flower, which is powerful. The buildings must derive all their own energy, their water, from their immediate surroundings. They have to process all their own waste. They have to use materials that can't give you cancer. They have to be beautiful. And importantly, they have to include equity and social justice. And they also have to be educational. So this notion of a flower in the form of a building is what the Living Building Challenge has basically challenged the design and engineering community to tackle. And when it was introduced 12 years ago, it was this crazy notion. Everyone said, "No, you might get one in the next 10 years, right?" Well, there's 400 of these worldwide that are being developed, and there's many in our community. So next slide. So a couple examples here on the island. We're working on a couple residential projects. Heron Hall is recently completed. It's water independent, so it captures all of its own rainwater and treats it locally on site. It produces all of its energy over a 12-month period using solar. It has passive solar strategies and radiant floors. We're doing another residential project as well. Miller Hall designed the Bullitt Center, which is in Capitol Hill, a 6-story office building, fully independent from the need to produce energy, and here in sunny Seattle, right? So it's showing what's possible, right? And this type of leadership is really important. And it's also, these are great places to live and work. And so the notion that there's an additional cost associated with this, well, there's going to be a lot of additional cost if we don't take action along these lines, right? The incremental costs of these types of systems and improvements to our design and our buildings is minimal compared to the external costs that we'll be facing as global warming increases. Next slide. So the process by which we do design is very different. We engage from the outset of a scientific understanding of the place, right? We have to recognize the importance of the place, and also equity and social justice, I've mentioned before. And we bring a full team together, and we start to collaborate and build ideas. And so in the breakout session after this, I'm going to ask for folks to participate along these same lines. But we iterate around this cycle of testing and analysis very quickly. And if something doesn't work, we fail fast, right? We don't hold on to ideas that aren't going to work. But ultimately, we test all of these concepts against the vision and commitments. And when we find the solution, we try to arrive at that as quickly as possible. Next slide. Data is so important to the work that we do. Being able to monitor and measure the performance of buildings, but then also reflect that back to the occupants so that the energy dashboards, water dashboards, can inform people about their own behaviors and their own actions and how they can reduce the impact of the building that they're using. Next slide. So we use a strategy for targeting net zero energy that starts with this notion of essentially a solar budget, right? We have financial budgets for buildings, but what we also like to think of is, what's the solar budget for this project? So it's essentially the renewable energy that can be produced on site, right? And that's normally the roof area covered in photovoltaic panels. And so that gives us an indicator, a size of the energy pie that we have, and then we kind of work backward from that. So looking at kind of a code compliant high performance building, how do we reduce that energy use in different steps? So the first step that we take is applying passive strategies, architectural strategies, right? So adding insulation, looking at daylighting, bringing in natural ventilation, different strategies that can help to reduce the systems. So then the second step here is about what are the systems that we're employing? Can they be radiant systems? Can they be more efficient? And can they be healthier and provide for a better feeling of comfort and well-being? And then the final step is the plug and process loads. And that's the equipment and the things that we plug into the walls. And how do we sort of like not only make those more efficient, but also influence user behavior so that they're using the facility in the most efficient way. And then ultimately we want those last two circles to be the same size, right? So that we can actually produce the same amount of energy on an annual basis as we consume. Next slide. So the Green Building Code, the city is getting ready to look into a green building code. It's part of the comprehensive plan, and I would encourage everyone to be involved in that process. The Zero Code is an example of an international standard for adopting green building principles and developing zero energy projects. Next slide. And we have some great examples of building codes here locally. The City of Seattle has an incentive program for Living Building Challenge projects. King County has adopted for all their municipal projects to target highest levels of performance. And this is through the King County Green Tools program, which assists in promoting green building throughout the county. So one of the things that they require is a LEED Platinum minimum standard for all their municipal projects. So this is real leadership that the city can look to as an example. And then they also, beyond LEED Platinum minimum, they say for each municipal project, we have to evaluate the potential for zero energy as well as Living Building Challenge certification. And there's a couple other examples I wanted to mention. San Jose has a target for all residential projects, all residential development to be zero carbon by 2020. So that's very soon. But for commercial buildings, 2030. So this type of aggressive, progressive green building codes are things that we can look to and model our actions on. The city of Berkeley, where I'm from, they just recently started discussing the idea of not allowing any combustion for any projects. So basically disconnecting from the existing from the existing natural gas lines. And for us, what would that mean? It'd probably mean like, do we want to allow more propane fired, heaters and appliances? So next slide. And so that's the issue that we need to tackle is we need to completely eliminate combustion in our facilities for heating. So turning to electrification, right? So heat pumps for heating and hot water. We need to turn to efficient appliances such as electric induction cooktops and smart meters, as well as heat recovery ventilators. These are all starting to just happen naturally because of market trends, the cost, the health, the wellness benefits. And the safety benefits from all these strategies are starting to be adopted regardless. Next slide. I just wanted to quickly talk about embodied carbon. So the embodied carbon is a real challenge for greenhouse gas emissions for buildings. So materials that and the construction carbon emissions associated with the construction and the materials are what's represented in embodied carbon. So operations we can tackle over time. The grid is decarbonizing, we can change out equipment, but the embodied carbon, the materials in construction, that's locked in from day one. And over the life of a high-performance building, a new high-performance building, that's about half, or a little bit more than half. But if you go to the next slide, but if you back that up to the time frame that we're really concerned about, 2050, it's 84%. So the embodied carbon is a really critical aspect, and it's a more challenging aspect that we have to tackle as architects and builders. And about half of this number is just the concrete, which is kind of crazy to think about. Next slide. Because cement, which is a primary component of concrete, if it was its own country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world after China and the US. Next slide. So we look at, we use LCA tools to evaluate and trying to find ways to reduce concrete and greenhouse gas emissions in the embodied carbon and materials in our projects. And that includes looking at negative carbon materials like wood and hemp fiber blocks and other strategies. Next slide. So, and then looking at a community scale, we are working with a campus to look at different strategies to basically, in the near term, midterm, and long term, ramp down to get them to zero carbon emissions by 2050. So these are things that when you compound them and when you take aggressive like goals, you can actually exceed the goals that you had initially targeted. And that's what we have been finding on these projects, and we're seeing some leadership around. Next slide. So what about for Bainbridge, right? What do we do? So I think we want to try and challenge ourselves, and we hope that we can get some great ideas going in the discussion round around these issues. Next slide. And ultimately, it's about where do we want to go from here? And can we envision a development that not only heals our relationship to the planet, but with one another? Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. It's clear we have some really amazing experts. Who knew about concrete? That's so shocking. Thank you. So now we're going to move to a topic of local generation from somebody who really not only knows what he's talking about, he's done it. And that's Joe Deets. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Fran. Great. Thank you, everybody. Well, I'm going to be talking about local energy generation here on Bainbridge. So I'm not going to be talking about residential generation, folks who want to do it for their home or for their business in the interest of time. I encourage you, if you're interested, talk to a reputable solar company, have an analysis done. But I'm going to be talking about community solar. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes is about community solar. What is it? Why should we do it? Why should we care? What do we get out of community solar projects here on Bainbridge? What are the notable challenges with these projects? And a case study that I did at Bainbridge Island City Hall. So next slide. So what is it? I think a good way to describe this is, what if all of us in this room said, we'd like to go solar for a big scale, and we all pooled our money together, and we picked a site on the island. A few I can think of: Station 21 at the fire station, perhaps the dump, Vincent Road, a couple others. So we pool our resources and put a photovoltaic system there. So voluntary participation, lots of different owners. But we do not own the property where the site is on. So we do not get the electricity from that site. It goes to the site owner's meter. The financial benefits that arise because you're generating electricity, which is a revenue stream, is, let's just say, negotiated between the participants and the property owners. And its project will be organized by some entity. In the case City Hall was a company I formed with Tammy and representing the participants. Another option for community solar is have the utility organize it. Quite a few community solar projects are organized by the electric utility. Notable examples are Seattle City Light, Vista, and Peninsula Power and Light down in Gig Harbor. Next slide. So, why should we do it? What's keeping you from doing it? Well, maybe you're like me, surrounded by trees. Not a good idea to go solar. Maybe you don't own your property. You're a renter. Maybe you just don't have the time to, negotiate and research and make this decision. And it's just you don't want to get into that, or you don't like the look of solar panels. I get it. It's all right. You'd rather have it somewhere else. Or there's a financial barrier. I mean, frankly, going solar for your home, you're easily talking a $20,000, $30,000 investment. So that's pretty significant. Next slide, please. So there's reasons to sort of pause as far as doing it for yourself. However, for community solar, there's distinct benefits for the customer, participant, for the utility, for the local jurisdiction. For the customer, investor, what do you get? Well, you're getting something in return. You're putting your money into a project. You're going to get some kind of financial return. That's a nice diversification of what other things you could do with your money. Invest in the stock market. When's our next black swan going to occur? I'm just saying. So the sun does not care about those things. The sun just does its thing. So it's a great diversification of your assets. It's convenient. These projects are designed to be very easy to participate. It's a hedge against rate increases. Any solar system, you're basically locking in on your energy costs at that point. Rates go up after that, doesn't matter. Clearly, attest to your personal values, why are we here, the climate change, all that. So very clear for the customer. For the utility, similarly, community solar helps them meet their renewable portfolio standards. It reduces stress on the grid. You're not having power come from hundreds of miles over transmission lines. It's being produced right in the community. Frankly, the investors, if we all pitched in and went community solar at a site on Bainbridge, we're kind of doing PSE's work, don't you think? And of course, environmental stewardship. It's a test to the utilities' support for this type of effort. For the local jurisdiction, well, I'd say it's economic development. You are creating infrastructure in your community, local job creation. Project I did at City Hall, we hired a firm out of Seattle, creating jobs. Clearly energy security. Are we in an earthquake area? Do we have risks that being an island and we have a 9-point earthquake? Just saying. With storage solutions attached to these projects, suddenly we have emergency power on site. And of course, the environmental stewardship option. Next slide. So, having said all that, from personal experience, there's some notable challenges for doing these projects. I was chatting with my facilitator, Brian. Where are you? Oh, there. And Brian was like, oh my God, I didn't realize how hard these projects are. One way of understanding is if you give a person money with the intention of getting money back, your principal and then some, that transaction is deemed a security. Once that occurs, a whole slew of regulatory laws kick in, some of these going back almost 100 years, and all well-meaning, but it frankly becomes a very high barrier for complying. In my case, I was raising money, the intention of people earning money in return, hopefully making a profit. But because the offering was less than $1 million, it was an exempt security. However, I still had to comply with some very notable rules, one of them which was I couldn't make a public offer. I couldn't put an ad in the paper, we're looking for investors. I couldn't tell the press we were doing that. I could only make an offer of folks I knew personally that I felt could handle the risk. So not surprisingly, all the folks who went into the Bainbridge project are friends of mine, or folks I know. So IRS rules, you get a tax credit for going solar at your home or your business. You don't get a tax credit for this because you don't own the property. We lucked out, if you will, for our project because at that time there was the 1603 Treasury grant that was initiated following the last financial catastrophe in the market. And so we were able to get the benefits of a cash infusion from Treasury, and which really made the grade for us. Some other regulatory hurdles I won't get into in the time that we have. So what this all means is you need legal expertise. These are not difficult in terms of the solar part of it. I mean, there could well be challenges, but there's definitely legal challenges. You need attorneys and very expert attorneys. I had the benefit of having a lawyer, Mike Moyer. I want to give him a shout out, Bainbridge Island attorney. He stepped forward, major law firm, and he gave us pro bono legal help. 6 figures of legal help to do our project. What this means, folks, is there's a high degree of difficulty to doing these projects, which makes it difficult for grassroots organizations to do them. Not so for utility-led projects. When you have $1 billion organization, like PSC, you have the capacity to do these projects one after another, as we've seen with Seattle City Light and Avista. Next slide. So a quick diagram how the projects can look at like visually or diagram-wise. We formed a company, Community Solar Solutions. I'm the president. We represented the 24 families, local families who were participating in the project. I negotiated with the host, which was the city of Bainbridge Island. I also worked with the utility to get the production incentives. Meanwhile, the city signed a net metering agreement with utility. All that to create that project. Next slide, please. So, quick timeline. The whole idea about community solar started in 2005. I gave a presentation at City Hall. I said, gee, wouldn't it be great if we put solar on this and invest in it? Too bad we can't because there's no incentive for it. And in the audience, there was a gentleman, State Senator Phil Rockefeller. Phil, raise your hand. Phil went to bat for us. He pushed for legislation, took 3 sessions, became law, community solar law. Amazing effort on his part because he was the state senator, chairman of the Senate Energy Committee. Then it took about a year for the Department of Revenue to create the rules. 2 years of me negotiating with the city of Bainbridge Island to let me use their roof at no cost. And then financing, I had lots of coffee with folks I knew about getting investors. That was not difficult. Folks got it. We would have clearly have gotten a lot more investors, but we kind of ran out of roof space. Total project size, just under 72 kilowatts. It's still the largest system on Bainbridge Island. Cost of under $500,000. Took about 3 weeks to do. So next slide. I think we're kind of close to being done. So one thing in the breakout session, I did, there's a student who's been helping me. He's a Western Washington student, a Bainbridge Islander, Ben. We did some quickie assessments on the island of some potential other community solar sites. We just scratched the surface, and I would present those during the breakout session of, folks, there's a lot of potential here. Currently, there's 268 photovoltaic systems on Bainbridge Island. 2 are community solar projects, which I've done, but there's a lot more sites. Think about it, 268. How many homes do we have on Bainbridge? Like 9,000? You know, so there's immense potential. And by the way, I was going to mention statewide, there's almost 22,000 PV systems for a state of 6.5 million. So we've barely scratched the surface for solar. So thank you, and I guess it's time for me to...
Perfect. What a great panel. And they did it all on time. Everybody did just what they were supposed to do. So this is great. So now we're breaking into small groups. And in the back is going to be Jason talking about buildings, and Herb Heathcote is his facilitator. So if you want to join the buildings group, your job is to help get the chairs possibly into 2 concentric circles. You want to be able to hear each other and converse. Down the hall in a classroom will be Randal, and Bobby Morgan is the facilitator. You can go to that one if you want to talk about our energy sources and what our options are. And then here in the front will be Joe Deets with Brian Anderson helping as facilitator. So again, form the circles. By 11:45, I want you back here, and we're going to hear from each group the 2 best ideas that you've come up with for the topic that you guys have been talking about. So now is our report back time, and so none of us could be in all 3 groups. We're going to hear, let's start with Randal's group.
I just wanted everybody to see how the votes went. We have 2 pieces of paper here. We'll hold them up tall because it was a pretty strong winners. You can see down here, this was the vote for a local pilot project with collaboration. This group was very strong on that, not angst and anger. It was let's collaborate, listen, and work together. It was really excellent and beautiful. That was the winner on this page, and the winner over here was back to public power. Let's not quit, let's not give up, let's figure it out, let's make it work. But we had a couple of people from our group who were gonna just chat briefly, if we have a minute or so, about each of those winners.
Jens and I are together. The idea on the collaboration was to enter in a very deliberate discourse with experts and community advocates here with PSE to become more intimate with the shared data about how we can truly collaborate and have Bainbridge be a shining star for PSE to get credit for as a result of very significant investments here. And my concern, at least, and perhaps others, is that the discourse hasn't been very satisfactory. So how can we make it more personal, more collaborative, and stage it in a series of interactions and then report back to the community about what the real facts are for making a transition to 100 in 2040? What's the feasibility? How can we make it happen?
Yeah, thank you, John. Let me just add, I've seen a lot of these projects come out in Germany, where I'm from, and there's a lot of momentum that a room like this can create. What I also personally struggle with is always the question whether to do something individual or together, in this case together with a company that may have different corporate goals. What I also learn is that coming together can really make a structural change, and the idea of this pilot project, or call it lighthouse project, could help both the community shine, but it may also help PSE shine in the longer term, where they may be pushed into a more sustainable path, but they still need to learn how to get there. And having a very concrete, on the ground project could help them to learn a lot and us to get one step further to a sustainable solution. So we call it kind of the integrated approach and collaborative approach.
This will be very brief. We saw a lot of momentum for public power. I can be very brief because Randal just really outlined the reasons for it, so you can review his slides if you want. I have them here. I'm not going to go into that in the interest of brevity. But I would just say that there was a lot of confusion on terms of what public power would look like. There was a lot of, I don't know, it wasn't misinformation, but just confusion. And I think in spite of all of that, there's still a lot of people out there that want to move forward. And if there is that sort of support for it, just accepting one defeat or not being successful the first time doesn't mean we can't be successful the next time. So my sense is move forward with it, keep that goal in mind, and let's figure out maybe when it's going to happen, not if it's going to happen.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to just go on to buildings and hear what the ideas were. Okay, thank you.
So there was a few ideas. I'll talk about the first one that came out as one of our top ideas. We actually had 3. So the first one is creating a task force for green building code that's coming up, and this is this idea that there's this need to make it urgent. But also involve all the various stakeholders. So we identified it should be tied to all the various council groups, as well as the volunteer groups like the DRB that I'm part of, but also CCAC, the ETAC group, the Design Review Board, Affordable Housing Task Force, and the Intergovernmental Working Group, as well as the MMAC, the Multimodal, and that we should be pushing the limits in terms of what's possible with this green building, that commercial development will continue to happen, that this is not going to, if we set the bar really high, the developers will figure it out, but in the end we'll have a much better island for it, and we won't get this sort of cookie cutter development that we have seen recently. So I'm going to hand it over for the next topic.
So we also realized, I think, that any building that's going to happen coming up is most likely going to be the school district. And so we got to talking about how we need to be talking to all the taxing districts, not just think about the city when we think about what needs to be happening with public buildings. And in particular, we talked about, let's see here. Well, right, so the city, we have the remodel of the police building, that we would like to see the city lead by example. And we were also talking about certainly the school district should be leading by example, that what they're doing with their rebuilding and remodeling could serve not only the function of achieving green building standards, but leading by example for children. I think that was it.
That's great. And then one last one, because we felt like this covered a lot of new development and some major renovations. This covered the sort of city leadership in terms of city-owned buildings and school-owned buildings, fire department. But we didn't want to leave out people who own their homes, businesses who own their buildings, and what are the incentives to support them to move away from combustion, to address energy efficiency in their own projects, in their own places of work and where they live. And so that's really important, because there needs to be something that the city does in order to support that transition.
I'm going off a little bit, but we did talk about this. When we talked about the potential for doing something like group buys or something like that, that is something the city could be doing, could be organizing group purchases of services and retrofit equipment and so forth for individual homeowners.
Yeah, and I think in general, if we adopted these 3 targets, what we could start to see is a real move towards a new economy for Bainbridge, and it could foster new innovative industries here on the island, and also provide for a reduced environmental impact, island wide, and just improve our quality of life. So.
So thank you, Jason. And now we'll move on to local generation. Joe Deets' group.
Yeah. Anyone want to join me? I was the only one who was still standing, I guess. So we weren't quite as organized as you guys. I'm jealous, but we were looked at this as, rather than looking at particular sites right now, because we just scratched the surface on site evaluations, although there was a lot of interest in the Vincent Road, the dump site, but quite a bit of work needs to go into that or any site analysis, which then leads to the question, shouldn't we do a dedicated study of what is available on this island for sites? Yes. So we need resources, talent, willpower to make that happen. Okay. Second is the structure of these projects. And we need to develop what is a good business model to structure this. I mean, do we want to follow kind of like I did at City Hall, perhaps, or is there another model that we can follow? So that in a parallel track, I think doing more of an analysis of what would be the business model of doing a collective community solar projects on the island. Third was some funding ideas. Brought up that the Clean Energy Department of Commerce has a clean energy fund. There's $2.2 million available right now for solar projects in Washington State. Just saying. And also, I'll just throw out green power. Who signs up for green power on this island? Like most of us, right? Do you know where that money goes? No, exactly. Do you know how much money is generated on the island from green power? Over $100,000. Over $100,000 leaves this island every year because us greenies put money in and we don't know where it goes. Could we capture that? My ask of the utility for many years has been, can we use some of those monies for local projects on the island? And that question's still out there. So just saying, there is money available. There's capital, there's grant monies available, there's tons of sites. We've just scratched the surface of what is potential on the island. We just need the will and the dedication to make that happen. So, Brian, do you have anything? Okay, thank you.
Okay, I want to thank all of you for being such great participants. It's 12 o'clock. We're right on time. Don't forget the donation box. You can help support this forum and our obligations to the church for hosting us. So I thank you. Keep in mind, put on your calendar, May 22nd, 7 o'clock, The Good Egg, to hear about adaptation from Laura Hansen. That will be amazing. So thank you, and thanks for all the good work that the organizations behind this Climate Energy Forum that has proved such a wonderful setting for airing great ideas and really thinking through our energy future. Thank you.